Millionaire broke into tears at the sight of the childhood friend who would now control it all. The same friend who shattered his trust 20 years ago and now stood before him as his company's new CEO. Morgan Wells smoothed the lapels of her charcoal suit as the elevator ascended to the top floor. After years of struggling to support her ailing father while building her career in healthcare innovation, she had finally achieved her dream. The CEO position, secured through a confidential executive search, represented everything she had worked for: stability, recognition, and the means to provide the best care for her father. 42nd floor, announced the elevator with a soft chime. Morgan took a deep breath, centering herself. The strange confidentiality around her hiring had been puzzling. She still didn't even know which healthcare company had selected her. But the compensation package and opportunity were too good to refuse. Today would bring answers. "Ms. Wells, welcome," greeted an elegant assistant as the doors opened. "The board is assembled and waiting to meet you. May I take your coat?" Morgan handed over her designer trench coat, a rare splurge she'd allowed herself to mark this milestone. "Thank you, I'm ready." As they walked toward the boardroom, Morgan mentally reviewed her opening remarks. First impressions mattered, especially for a woman who had fought twice as hard for every promotion. This was her moment to shine. Before we dive deep into this heartfelt story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It's free, as your support helps us create more meaningful stories for you. Enjoy the story. The heavy oak doors swung open, and Morgan stepped inside with confident strides. 12 board members turned to look at her with expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. But Morgan barely noticed them. Her entire focus locked onto the man standing at the head of the table, a man she hadn't seen in over 20 years. Ethan Carter. Morgan froze mid-step, the blood draining from her face. Ethan, her childhood best friend, her college classmate, the boy who had once meant everything to her before their bitter falling out, was standing right in front of her. This was his company. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I present Morgan Wells, our new Chief Executive Officer," announced the chairman, unaware of the tension crackling through the room. Across the table, Ethan stood perfectly still, his blue eyes wide with recognition. The lanky boy from their struggling neighborhood had transformed into an imposing figure in an impeccable suit, but those eyes, those summer sky blue eyes, were exactly the same. And then something extraordinary happened. Ethan's composed expression crumpled. A tear slid down his cheek, followed by another and another. The notoriously stoic businessman who never showed emotion was openly crying at the sight of her. The board members shifted uncomfortably. Someone dropped a pen. Another cleared their throat. No one knew how to react to this unprecedented display from their usually unflappable leader. "Morgan," Ethan whispered, her name sounding like it had been torn from his chest. She stood rooted to the spot, memories flooding back. 2 kids supporting each other's dreams, late nights studying together, his grandmother's care facility that had inspired his first healthcare concept, and then that final, devastating argument where he'd accused her of stealing his idea. That day, he had cut her from his life completely, ignoring all her attempts to contact him afterward. "Ethan," she managed, her voice barely steady. His assistant appeared with a handkerchief. Ethan quickly composed himself, wiping away the tears and straightening his shoulders. When he looked up again, his expression had hardened, the vulnerability replaced by cold professionalism. "I apologize for the unusual welcome," he said to the board. "Ms. Wells and I have history, ancient history." His voice carried an edge of warning. "But I assure you, it won't affect our professional relationship." His gaze returned to Morgan, now sharp and calculating. "Welcome to Carter Wellness, Ms. Wells. We have high expectations for your leadership." Morgan forced a professional smile, trying to recover from her shock. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. I look forward to exceeding those expectations." But inside, her mind was racing with questions. Had he known she was being hired? Was this some elaborate setup? Their eyes remained locked across the polished table. The tears might have shown something human still existed beneath Ethan's carefully constructed facade, but his swift recovery and cool tone made one thing clear. Despite his emotional reaction, this wasn't a happy reunion. The wounds of their past were still raw, and now they would have to find a way to work together despite everything that had torn them apart. Morgan lifted her chin slightly. She hadn't come this far to be derailed by the past. Her father needed her to succeed. She would prove herself to this board, to this company, and, perhaps most importantly, to Ethan Carter. The board meeting concluded with clinical efficiency. Morgan maintained her professional demeanor as Ethan introduced the executive team and outlined the company's current projects. She nodded at appropriate intervals, asked relevant questions, and pretended her heart wasn't hammering against her ribcage with each glance from those familiar blue eyes. When they finally adjourned, Morgan was grateful for the executive assistant who appeared at her elbow. "I'll show you to your office, Ms. Wells," Alicia said. "Mr. Carter has arranged for all the transition materials to be prepared for you." Morgan followed her down a corridor of glass and steel, acutely aware of the stares from employees who had clearly heard about their new CEO but hadn't expected her today. She caught snippets of whispered conversations that ceased abruptly as she passed. Her office was a corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the city skyline. Sleek and minimalist, it spoke of power and precision, much like the company itself. "Your credentials are all set up," Alicia explained, indicating the laptop on the desk. "Security access, email, server permissions, everything you'll need. Mr. Carter was quite insistent that you have full access from day one." Morgan raised an eyebrow. "That's thorough." "Mr. Carter is always thorough," Alicia replied with practiced neutrality. "Is there anything else you need right now?" "No, thank you. I think I'll take some time to review these materials." Once alone, Morgan sank into the ergonomic chair and closed her eyes. The morning shock had left her drained. Of all the healthcare companies in the country, how had she ended up at Ethan's? Had he known she was being hired? His tears suggested surprise, but with Ethan, nothing was ever simple. Her phone vibrated with a text from her father. "How's the first day going, sweetheart?" Morgan stared at the message, unsure how to respond. Eventually she typed, "Full of surprises. Will call tonight." She turned to the laptop and began reviewing company documents, determined to gain her footing. Carter Wellness was preparing to launch LifeLink, a revolutionary senior care system. Morgan's eyes widened as she read the specifications. The system would allow seniors to remain in their homes longer while providing comprehensive monitoring and support, exactly the kind of innovation she had dedicated her career to. It was also eerily similar to the concept she and Ethan had discussed in college, inspired by visits to his grandmother's depressing care facility. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Morgan looked up to find Ethan standing in her doorway, his expression unreadable. "I thought we should talk," he said flatly. "Privately." Morgan gestured to one of the chairs facing her desk. "By all means." Ethan closed the door and sat down, his posture rigid. For a moment, neither spoke. 20 years of silence stretched between them like a chasm. "I didn't know," Ethan finally said. "About you being hired. The board handled the executive search. Your name never appeared in the materials they shared with me." Morgan studied his face, looking for signs of deception. "That's quite a coincidence." "Is it?" His jaw tightened. "Perhaps it's exactly what we deserve after everything." The bitterness in his voice sparked her own. "After everything? You mean after you accused me of stealing your idea and then cut me out of your life without letting me explain?" What was there to explain? Ethan's eyes flashed. "I shared my grandmother's care facility concept with you in confidence. 2 weeks later, Professor Harmon was praising your innovative approach to senior care that sounded remarkably familiar. I developed that independently, Morgan countered, the old defense rising automatically to her lips. You weren't the only one who cared about improving elder care. Right. His laugh held no humor. Just like you independently developed every other groundbreaking concept you've built your career on. Morgan flinched as if he'd slapped her. That's unfair, and you know it. I tried to contact you for weeks after that argument. You were the one who disappeared. Ethan's expression flickered with something unreadable. It doesn't matter now. Ancient history, like I told the board. He straightened, all business again. We have a company to run. LifeLink launches in 6 weeks. It's the culmination of everything I've worked for since college. The irony isn't lost on me, Morgan said quietly. Ethan continued, ignoring her comment. The question is whether we can work together. The board hired you because your track record in healthcare innovation is impressive. They believe, and I have to agree, that you're the right person to take Carter Wellness to the next level. Despite our history, business is business. His gaze was steady. I'm professional enough to separate the past from the present if you are. Morgan felt a surge of determination. She hadn't fought her way up the corporate ladder to be intimidated now, not even by the ghost of her former best friend. I'm here to do a job, Ethan. A job I'm exceptionally good at. Our personal history won't interfere with that. Something like respect flickered in his eyes. Good. The transition materials include everything you need to know about LifeLink and our launch strategy. I expect you to be fully briefed by the department meeting tomorrow morning. He stood to leave, but paused at the door. One more thing, Morgan. LifeLink isn't just a product to me. It's personal. The intensity in his voice made her look up. My grandmother died alone in that facility while I was away at college, he said quietly. LifeLink is for her and for everyone like her. I won't let anything or anyone jeopardize it. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Morgan alone with the weight of his words. She turned back to her laptop, scrolling through the LifeLink specifications with newfound interest. It was remarkable, really. The system Ethan had created was almost exactly what she would have designed herself. Perhaps they weren't so different after all, despite everything that had driven them apart. Morgan reached for her phone and dialed her father. Hey, Dad, how are you feeling today? Better now that I hear your voice, he replied, his words slightly slurred from his medication. Tell me about the new job. Morgan hesitated, watching the city lights begin to glimmer as dusk settled. It's going to be challenging in ways I never expected, she said carefully, but I think it might also be exactly where I'm supposed to be. She didn't tell him about Ethan. Some wounds were still too fresh to expose to the light, even after all these years. The next few weeks passed in a blur of meetings, product reviews, and strategy sessions. Morgan threw herself into understanding every aspect of Carter Wellness, working long hours to prove herself to the executive team and, though she wouldn't admit it, to Ethan. Each morning she arrived before dawn to review reports in the quiet of her office. Each evening she called her father before diving back into work until the cleaning staff politely suggested they needed to lock up. She was determined to leave no detail unexamined, no opportunity unexplored. By the third week, Morgan had earned grudging respect from the senior leadership. Her suggestions for LifeLink's user interface had been implemented, improving the experience for seniors with limited tech familiarity. Her marketing strategy had impressed the board enough to increase the launch budget by 15%. Only with Ethan did progress remain glacial. Their interactions were strictly professional, confined to meetings where others were present. He acknowledged her contributions with curt nods but maintained a careful distance as though proximity might reopen old wounds. Until the day Morgan stayed late to review customer testing videos. She sat in the darkened conference room, watching recordings of seniors interacting with LifeLink prototypes. Something wasn't right. The facial recognition feature that was supposed to automatically log users in was failing too often, causing frustration. I noticed that too. Morgan startled at Ethan's voice. He stood in the doorway, tie loosened, sleeves rolled up to his elbows. For a moment, he looked like the college student she had known, the one who would stay up all night solving problems. The algorithm struggles with users who have Parkinson's tremors, she observed, recovering quickly. It's trying to match a moving target. Ethan entered the room and took a seat beside her, close enough that she caught the faint scent of his cologne. The development team says it's within acceptable parameters. Acceptable parameters aren't good enough. Morgan rewound the video to an elderly woman whose hands shook as she tried repeatedly to log in. Look at her face. That's not acceptance. That's defeat. Ethan watched silently. In the blue glow of the screen, his expression softened. You always did see the human element that others missed. The unexpected compliment hung in the air between them. We have 3 weeks until launch, Morgan said, refocusing on the problem. If we adjust the recognition window and add voice authentication as backup, we could fix this. The team says that would take at least a month to implement and test. Then we get a better team. Morgan turned to face him directly. This is the difference between a good product and a great one, Ethan. Between something that works and something that transforms lives. Their eyes locked, and for the first time since her arrival, she saw something other than coldness or suspicion in his gaze. Show me what you're thinking, he said quietly. They worked side by side until midnight, sketching solutions on the conference room whiteboard. It felt strangely familiar, this collaboration, as if the intervening years had momentarily collapsed. Morgan found herself relaxing into the rhythm of their shared problem-solving, finishing his sentences, building on his ideas. We'll need to pull Kevin from the analytics team, Ethan said, standing back to examine their work. He's the only one who can code this quickly enough. And Sasha for user testing, Morgan added. She has experience with Parkinson's patients. Ethan nodded, taking a photo of the whiteboard with his phone. I'll have them start first thing tomorrow. As they gathered their things to leave, an awkward silence descended. The easy collaboration of the past few hours had broken their carefully maintained professional distance, leaving them in uncertain territory. Your father, Ethan said suddenly. How is he? Morgan looked up, surprised by the personal question. Managing. The new medication helps with the tremors, but the cognitive decline is... She trailed off, unused to discussing her father's condition at work. I'm sorry. The simple words seemed to carry the weight of more than just sympathy for her father's illness. Thank you. Morgan hesitated, then added, He asks about you sometimes. He always liked you. A shadow passed over Ethan's face. I liked him, too. He checked his watch, retreating back into formality. It's late. I'll walk you to your car. The night air was cool as they crossed the parking garage in silence. When they reached Morgan's car, Ethan cleared his throat. The work you did tonight, he said, his voice carefully neutral. It was good. Really good. I know, Morgan replied with a small smile. That's why you hired me. I didn't hire you, he reminded her. The board did. And yet, here I am. She met his gaze steadily. Working on the same problems we dreamed of solving 20 years ago. Something flickered in his eyes, a hint of the connection they had once shared. Then it was gone, replaced by his now familiar reserve. Good night, Morgan. She watched him walk away, his figure receding into the shadows of the parking garage. Progress, she thought. Small, but undeniable. The next morning, Morgan arrived to find a development team already assembled in the conference room. Kevin and Sasha sat among them, coffee cups in hand, looking expectantly toward the door as she entered. Mr. Carter briefed us on the authentication changes, Kevin explained. We've been here since 5, working on implementation options. Morgan blinked in surprise. He authorized the resources already? Said it was top priority, Sasha confirmed. We're to give you whatever you need to make it happen before launch. Throughout the day, Morgan led the team through solutions and testing protocols. She sent updates to Ethan, but received only brief acknowledgments in return. Their moment of connection had evidently passed, but the resources at her disposal spoke volumes. It was nearly 7 when she finally headed home, satisfied with the day's progress. As she passed Ethan's darkened office, his assistant stopped her. He had to leave for a personal matter, Alicia explained, handing Morgan a folder. But he asked me to give you this. Inside was a handwritten note attached to a legal document. Morgan, these are the original patents for LifeLink's core technology. I thought you should have copies for your records. E. Morgan flipped through the documents, her breath catching as she recognized elements from their college discussions. At the bottom of the final page was a note she nearly missed. Some ideas are meant to be shared. She stared at the words, written in the same precise handwriting she remembered from study sessions years ago. Was this an olive branch? An acknowledgement that perhaps their falling out had been based on a misunderstanding? Morgan slipped the folder into her bag, unsure what to make of this unexpected gesture. But as she drove home that night, she felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks. Hope that perhaps the rift between them wasn't beyond repair after all. The next morning, Morgan arrived at the office to find an unexpected guest waiting in her reception area. Marco Phillips, the man introduced himself, extending a manicured hand. Senior Vice President of Business Development at Nexacare. Morgan recognized the name immediately. Nexacare was their biggest competitor in the senior care technology market. She shook his hand with a professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. What can I do for you, Mr. Phillips? I was hoping to discuss a potential partnership, he said smoothly. Perhaps over lunch? Morgan's instincts flared. Any partnership discussions would need to include our full executive team. I'm afraid my schedule is packed today with launch preparations. Of course. His smile remained fixed. Another time, perhaps. We're very interested in what Carter Wellness is developing. After he left, Morgan immediately called Ethan, who agreed to meet her in the secure conference room. How did he get past security? Ethan demanded when she told him about the visit. He had a visitor's badge, Morgan replied. Someone approved his entry. Ethan's expression darkened. I want to know who, and I want all partnership inquiries directed to legal immediately. He mentioned being interested in what we're developing, Morgan added. Something about his timing feels wrong. The launch is in 2 weeks, Ethan agreed. We need to be careful. They doubled security protocols for the LifeLink project and restricted access to the development servers. The authentication fix Morgan had championed was nearly complete, and early testing showed remarkable improvement in the user experience. For the first time since her arrival, Morgan felt truly part of the team. She and Ethan had established a wary professional respect, if not the friendship they once shared. The executive team had begun coming to her with questions and ideas. Even the board chairman had commended her work at their last meeting. Then disaster struck. Morgan was reviewing the final launch presentation when Alicia burst into her office without knocking. You need to see this, she said, turning on the wall-mounted television. A breaking business news segment showed Nexicare's CEO announcing their newest product, Senior Link, a comprehensive home-based care system for the elderly. The features he described were nearly identical to LifeLink, down to the authentication solution Morgan had developed. Most devastating of all was the release date. Next week, a full 7 days before Carter Wellness planned to launch LifeLink. Get Ethan, Morgan ordered, already reaching for her phone to call the executive team together. Within 30 minutes, the crisis meeting was underway. The mood was grim as they watched the recorded announcement again. It's not just similar, the marketing director said. It's practically identical. How is this possible? Corporate espionage, the security chief suggested. They must have infiltrated our system somehow. Morgan studied the Senior Link interface shown in the promotional video. The resemblance to their product was uncanny, right down to the voice authentication backup they had only implemented last week. The stock was already responding. Carter Wellness shares had dropped 12% in the hour since Nexicare's announcement, and investors were flooding the company with concerned calls. Ethan sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of controlled fury. "I want answers," he said quietly. "How did they get our specifications? Who leaked our launch strategy? And what are we going to do about it?" The meeting lasted hours as they developed a response plan. Legal would investigate potential patent infringements. Marketing would reposition their messaging to emphasize LifeLink's superior quality and testing. Development would look for ways to add features before their launch. As the team dispersed with their assignments, Ethan asked Morgan to stay behind. "This is a nightmare," he said once they were alone, running a hand through his hair. 2 years of work, millions in development, all potentially wasted because someone couldn't be trusted. "We don't know that it was an inside job," Morgan pointed out, though she shared his suspicion. "Don't we?" His eyes were hard. The authentication solution wasn't in any public documentation. Only the development team and senior leadership knew about it. Morgan felt a chill at his words. "You're not suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything yet." Ethan stood and moved to the window, his back to her. "I've asked IT security to audit all system access for the past month. We'll know soon enough where the leak came from." "We should focus on salvaging the launch," Morgan said. "Nexicare may have beaten us to market, but we can still position LifeLink as the premium alternative." Ethan turned, studying her with an unreadable expression. "Always looking forward. That's what I—" He stopped abruptly. "That's an admirable quality in a CEO." Morgan pretended not to notice his slip. "It's either look forward or give up. I've never been good at giving up." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I remember." For a brief moment, the tension between them eased. Then Ethan's phone rang, shattering the moment. "I need to take this," he said, checking the screen. "It's the board chairman." Morgan nodded and left him to the call. As she walked back to her office, she couldn't shake the feeling that their fragile progress was about to be tested in ways neither of them had anticipated. The next few days passed in a blur of emergency meetings and strategy sessions. The development team worked around the clock to add distinctive features to LifeLink. Marketing crafted a new campaign emphasizing their rigorous testing and medical partnerships. Legal filed preliminary paperwork for patent infringement. Through it all, Morgan and Ethan worked side by side, their past differences temporarily set aside in the face of this existential threat to the company. Late nights became the norm, with dinner ordered in as they refined their counter-strategy. On the third night, as they reviewed the revised launch presentation in Ethan's office, Morgan noticed him wincing as he reached for his coffee. "Are you okay?" she asked. "Just stress," he dismissed, massaging his left shoulder. "The board isn't happy about the stock drop. They're looking for someone to blame." "We're doing everything possible," Morgan assured him. "The team is pulling together remarkably well under pressure." Ethan nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "IT Security's preliminary report comes tomorrow. If they find evidence of internal leaks—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew what it would mean for the company, and potentially for their working relationship. "Let's cross that bridge when we come to it," Morgan suggested. "For now, we focus on what we can control." Later that night, as Morgan finally headed home, she found herself reflecting on how quickly things had changed. A month ago, she and Ethan had been estranged by 20 years of misunderstanding and hurt. Now, they were united in crisis, their old connection resurfacing in unexpected ways. She wondered what would happen once the crisis passed. Would they return to their careful professional distance? Or was there a chance to rebuild something of what they had lost? As she pulled into her driveway, her phone chimed with a text from Ethan. Security report moved up. Meeting tomorrow, 8 a.m. boardroom. Morgan stared at the message, a sense of foreboding washing over her. Whatever the report revealed would likely change everything. Again. Morgan arrived early for the 8 a.m. meeting, coffee in hand and a knot of anxiety in her stomach. The boardroom was empty save for Ethan, who stood staring out the window, his posture rigid with tension. "Morning," she greeted him, setting her coffee on the table. He turned, and the expression on his face stopped her cold. His eyes, which had begun to warm toward her in recent days, were now arctic. "The security team will be here shortly," he said, his voice clipped, "along with the board chairman and legal counsel." Morgan felt her professional mask slip into place. "I see." Before she could question him further, the door opened as the others filed in. The security chief, Marcus Reed, carried a tablet and avoided making eye contact with Morgan. The board chairman, Harold Winters, looked grim. The company's head lawyer completed the group, her expression carefully neutral. "Let's get started," Harold said once everyone was seated. "Marcus, please share your findings." Marcus cleared his throat. "We conducted a thorough audit of all system access for the past month, focusing particularly on the lifelink specifications and the authentication solution development." He tapped his tablet, and a series of graphs appeared on the main screen. "We found evidence of unusual access patterns from one particular account." Morgan watched as he navigated to a detailed log showing access times and file directories. "These files were accessed during off hours and copied to an external device," Marcus continued. "The account credentials used belonged to—" He paused, glancing uncomfortably at Ethan. "Ms. Wells." The room fell silent. Morgan felt as though she'd been doused with ice water. "That's impossible," she said, leaning forward. "I've never accessed those files outside of working hours, and I certainly haven't copied anything to external devices." "The logs don't lie," Marcus replied, though he still wouldn't meet her eyes. "Your credentials were used at 2:17 a.m. last Tuesday to access the authentication solution specifications and the launch strategy documents." Morgan shook her head. "I was home asleep. Anyone could have used my credentials if they obtained them somehow." "We considered that possibility," Marcus said. "However, the access originated from your office computer, which requires both your ID badge for room entry and your fingerprint to unlock." "That's absurd," Morgan protested, turning to Ethan. "I wasn't here at 2 a.m. You know how hard we've been working on the counter strategy. Why would I sabotage that?" Ethan's expression remained stonily impenetrable. "We found something else," he said quietly, nodding to Marcus. The security chief hesitated, then brought up a new screen showing a series of emails. "These were recovered from a hidden folder in your email account," Marcus explained. "They appear to be communications with someone at Nexicare, dating back to your first week at Carter Wellness." Morgan stared at the screen in disbelief. The emails showed what appeared to be conversations between her and Marco Phillips, discussing lifelink specifications and launch plans. The most recent was dated just before Nexicare's announcement. "These are fabricated," she said, her voice rising with incredulity. "I've never sent these emails. I met Marco Phillips exactly once, when he showed up unannounced in my office." Harold Winters sighed heavily. "Ms. Wells, the evidence is quite damning. Your credentials were used to access sensitive information that subsequently appeared in a competitor's product. Emails from your account show ongoing communication with that competitor." "I'm being framed," Morgan insisted, turning again to Ethan. "Someone has gone to elaborate lengths to make it look like I betrayed the company." Ethan stood slowly, his hands pressed flat against the table. "I made the mistake of trusting you twice in my life," he said, his voice so quiet everyone had to strain to hear it. "Never again." The words struck her like physical blows. "Ethan, you can't possibly believe I would do this." "What I believe," he replied coldly, "is that history repeats itself. 20 years ago, you took my ideas for your own benefit. Why should now be any different?" Morgan felt a flash of anger cut through her shock. "I didn't steal your ideas in college, and I haven't leaked anything to Nexicare. If you'd bothered to listen 20 years ago instead of cutting me out of your life, you would know that." "The board will need to make a formal decision," Harold interjected. "But in the meantime, Ms. Wells, we'll need to suspend your access and escort you from the building." "This is outrageous," Morgan protested, but she could see from their expressions that minds were already made up. Ethan wouldn't look at her as security was called. "Clear out your personal items," he said flatly. "Someone will walk you out." "Look at me," Morgan demanded, stepping closer to him. When he finally raised his eyes to hers, she saw nothing of the connection they had begun to rebuild. "I didn't do this, Ethan. Someone is setting me up, and if you can't see that, you're not half the visionary everyone thinks you are." A muscle twitched in his jaw, but he said nothing as the security guard arrived to escort her to her office. Morgan gathered her few personal items in stunned silence, aware of the stares from employees as she was walked through the building. Her professional reputation, built meticulously over 20 years, was in tatters. Her dream job had evaporated in a matter of minutes. And Ethan had discarded her again without a second thought. Outside, the spring air felt inappropriately pleasant against her skin. Morgan sat in her car for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened. When she finally found the strength to drive, she headed not home but to her father's small house in the suburbs. Robert Wells was having a good day. He recognized Morgan immediately when she entered, his weathered face lighting up with a smile that quickly faded as he noticed her expression. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice wavering slightly from his condition. Morgan sank onto the couch beside him, suddenly exhausted. "I've been fired, Dad." "Fired? But you just started. What happened?" She explained as simply as she could, watching her father's expression shift from confusion to indignation. "That's ridiculous," he declared. "You would never do such a thing." "Try telling that to Ethan," Morgan said bitterly. "He was all too ready to believe the worst of me. Again." Her father's face changed at the mention of Ethan's name. A strange, guilty look passed over his features. "Ethan," he repeated. "Ethan Carter? You're Ethan." Morgan nodded, suddenly alert to his unusual reaction. "Yes, it turns out Carter Wellness is his company. Did you know?" Robert shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "No, I didn't know that was his company. But Morgan, there's something I need to tell you." A heaviness settled in Morgan's chest. "What is it, Dad?" Her father looked down at his trembling hands. "Ethan tried to contact you," he admitted quietly. "Years ago, while you were away on that fellowship in Boston. He came to the house several times, left messages. I never told you." Morgan stared at him in disbelief. "What? Why wouldn't you tell me?" "I thought he was bad for you," Robert confessed, shame evident in his voice. "After that awful fight you had in college, you were so devastated. I didn't want to see you hurt like that again. So I told him you didn't want to speak to him, and I never passed along his messages." The room seemed to tilt around Morgan. All these years, she had believed Ethan had simply written her off completely, that he had never even tried to make amends or hear her side. "Dad, how could you?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "I thought I was protecting you," he said, tears welling in his eyes. "I was wrong, Morgan. So wrong, and now look what's happened." Morgan sat in stunned silence, reprocessing 20 years of hurt and misunderstanding in light of this revelation. Ethan had tried to reach her, and her father, with misguided intentions, had severed that lifeline before she even knew it existed. The following days passed in a blur of humiliation and desperation. Morgan applied for unemployment benefits, only to discover she was under investigation for corporate espionage. Her professional contacts suddenly became unavailable. former colleagues stopped returning her calls. Her father's health deteriorated rapidly from the stress. His tremors worsened, and on Tuesday, he fell in the bathroom, resulting in an overnight hospital stay they could ill afford without her income. "I'm so sorry," he kept saying, his voice weaker than before. "This is all my fault." "It's not your fault, Dad," Morgan assured him, though part of her couldn't help but wonder how different things might have been if Ethan's messages had reached her all those years ago. With medical bills mounting and her professional reputation in ruins, Morgan faced the bleakest outlook of her career. She had always prided herself on resilience, on finding solutions to impossible problems, but this seemed beyond fixing. How did you prove a negative? How could she demonstrate she hadn't leaked information she'd never accessed? One evening, after another fruitless day of job searching and talking to lawyers who required retainers she couldn't afford, Morgan sat on her living room floor surrounded by boxes. If she couldn't pay next month's rent, she'd need to downsize quickly. Better to start sorting now than wait for an eviction notice. The box, labeled College, caught her eye. She hadn't opened it in years, having packed away those painful memories along with her textbooks and class notes. With nothing left to lose, she lifted the lid. Inside were remnants of a life that seemed to belong to someone else. Photos of her and Ethan in the library, ticket stubs from campus events they'd attended together, notebooks filled with her neat handwriting alongside his messier scrawl in the margins. At the bottom of the box lay an old USB drive she barely remembered. Out of curiosity, she plugged it into her laptop. The files were dated from her senior year, class projects, research papers, and a folder simply labeled Senior Care Initiative. With trembling fingers, Morgan opened it. There, preserved in digital amber, was her independent research project on aging-in-place technology. The timestamp showed it had been created 3 months before her final argument with Ethan. The detailed framework outlined a system remarkably similar to what would eventually become Lifelink, and to what she had allegedly stolen from Ethan. She hadn't stolen his idea. She had developed a parallel concept independently, driven by the same concerns for improving senior care. And here was the proof, untouched for 20 years. Morgan stared at the screen, tears streaming down her face. This evidence of her past innocence felt like a cruel joke now. It might clear her name in history, but it did nothing to restore her current reputation or prove she hadn't leaked information to Nexicare. She was about to close the laptop when her phone rang. Unknown number. "Hello? Ms. Wells?" It was a woman's voice, hushed and anxious. "This is Alicia, Mr. Carter's assistant." Morgan sat up straighter. "Alicia? Why are you calling me?" "I shouldn't be," she admitted, "but something happened today that you should know about. Kevin Chang from cybersecurity found evidence that your login credentials were cloned." Morgan's heart raced. "What?" "Someone created a duplicate of your ID badge and spoofed your fingerprint scan. They're doing a full investigation now, but Kevin thinks it was an inside job. Someone with high-level access." "Have they told Ethan?" Morgan asked, hope flaring for the first time in days. "That's just it," Alicia replied, her voice dropping even lower. "Mr. Carter had Mr. Chang report directly to him first before informing the board. He's been in his office reviewing the findings all afternoon." "Thank you for telling me this," Morgan said, mind racing with possibilities. "There's more," Alicia continued. "Right after Mr. Chang left, James Ward came to see Mr. Carter. He's the VP of Product Development." "I know who he is," Morgan interrupted. Ward had been notably cold toward her from day one, challenging her ideas in meetings and whispering with board members when he thought she wasn't looking. They had a massive argument. Security was called when it got physical. They found files on Ward's personal laptop, specifications he'd been selling to Nexicare for months. He was behind everything. Morgan closed her eyes, relief washing over her like a wave. "So, I've been cleared?" "Not officially," Alicia hedged. "But Mr. Carter, he looked devastated when he realized what happened. I've never seen him like that. not even when his grandmother died. He asked me for your address." A knock at the door made Morgan jump. "I think he might already be here," she said quietly. "Be kind to him," Alicia said unexpectedly. "He was wrong about you, but he's suffering for it." Morgan ended the call and approached the door. Through the peephole, she saw Ethan standing on her porch, looking more disheveled than she'd ever seen him. His tie was askew, his hair tousled as if he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly. She opened the door but remained in the threshold, blocking his entry. "Morgan," he began, his voice hoarse, "I owe you an apology, a massive, life-altering apology." "For which time?" she asked coolly. "For accusing me in college, for ignoring my attempts to contact you, or for publicly humiliating me and destroying my career last week?" He flinched at each item on her list. "For all of it, but especially for not trusting you now, when I should have known better." "Come in," she said finally, stepping aside. "I think we have a lot to talk about." Ethan entered cautiously, taking in the boxes scattered across her living room floor. "You're packing?" "I can't make rent without a job," she replied simply, "and my job prospects aren't great for someone under investigation for corporate espionage." "That's been dropped," he said quickly. "I've already notified the authorities and the board. James Ward confessed to everything once we confronted him with the evidence. He'd been selling information to Nexicare for nearly a year." Morgan gestured for him to sit on the couch while she took the armchair opposite. "Why did you come here, Ethan?" He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "To apologize in person, to offer you your job back, to—" He hesitated. "To finally have the conversation we should have had 20 years ago." Morgan studied him. This man who had been her closest friend, then her greatest hurt, then her colleague, and now sat before her looking utterly lost. "I found something today," she said, turning her laptop toward him to show the senior care project files. "I didn't steal your idea in college, Ethan. I developed my own research independently. The timestamps prove it." He barely glanced at the screen. "I know," he said quietly. "I found out years ago." Morgan stared at him. "What?" "After graduation, Professor Harmon admitted he'd played us against each other. He was jealous of our partnership, thought we were too codependent. He deliberately made it seem like you'd taken my concept when you'd actually developed your own similar version." "And you didn't think to tell me this?" Morgan asked incredulously. "I tried," Ethan replied, meeting her gaze directly. "I came to your house at least a dozen times. I called. I wrote letters. But your father—" "I know about that," Morgan interrupted. "He told me after I was fired. He thought he was protecting me." Ethan nodded slowly. "By the time I realized you weren't getting my messages, years had passed. I'd started Carter Wellness. My grandmother had died. I convinced myself it was too late, that you'd moved on and wouldn't want to hear from me." "So you tracked my career instead," Morgan said, remembering the folder of clippings Alicia had mentioned in the original plot. "You kept tabs on me all these years." Ethan looked down at his hands. "It started as a way to make sure you were okay. Then it became a habit I couldn't break. Seeing your accomplishments, watching you rise through the ranks, it made me feel connected to you somehow, even if you didn't know it. And yet, when we finally reunited, you were so quick to think the worst of me," Morgan observed, the hurt still raw in her voice. "Because I was afraid," he admitted, looking up with naked vulnerability in his eyes. "Afraid that the connection I felt when you walked into that boardroom was one-sided. Afraid that if I let myself trust you, I'd lose you again. So when the evidence pointed to you, it was almost a relief, confirmation that my walls were justified." "That's pretty messed up, Ethan." "I know." He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. "I've spent 20 years building a company while dismantling my ability to trust. It's going to take time to fix that. But I'd like to try, starting with you, if you'll give me the chance." Morgan looked at this man who had once been her everything, who had then become her nothing, and who now sat before her offering a third beginning. "I don't know if I can come back to Carter Wellness," she said honestly. "Too much has happened." "I understand," he replied, though disappointment flashed across his face. "But what about—" His words cut off abruptly as he grimaced, his hand moving to his chest. "Ethan?" Morgan leaned forward, alarmed by the sudden pallor of his skin. "Are you okay?" He tried to respond, but only managed a strangled sound before collapsing forward off the couch. Morgan rushed to the hospital, her heart pounding with emotions she couldn't quite name. Relief, certainly. Anxiety, definitely. But something else, too. Something that had been growing steadily as she'd worked to save the company he'd built. When she entered his room, Ethan was sitting up in bed, pale but alert. His eyes found hers immediately. "Morgan," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. "You're here." "Of course I'm here," she replied, taking the chair beside his bed. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been hit by a truck," he admitted with a weak smile. "The doctors say I was lucky. Another hour without treatment and—" He let the sentence hang unfinished. Morgan nodded, memories of that terrifying night still fresh. "You gave me quite a scare." "I'm sorry." His eyes held hers intently. "For that, and for everything else." "We've already covered that part," Morgan reminded him, "before you decided to dramatically collapse on my living room floor." A ghost of his old smile touched his lips. Always had a flair for timing. His expression turned serious. "The company? What's happening with LifeLink? The launch?" Morgan hesitated, uncertain how much to tell him. The doctors had warned against causing him any stress. "You should focus on your recovery, not work." "Morgan," he said firmly, "I need to know." She sighed, recognizing the stubborn determination that had been part of him since childhood. Nexacare launched their product early as planned, but they rushed it, and it's having major technical issues. Hope flickered in his eyes. "And LifeLink?" "We launched an emergency soft rollout yesterday," she admitted. "Early feedback is extremely positive. The stock has already started to recover." Ethan's eyebrows rose. "We? You came back to the company?" "As a consultant," Morgan clarified. "Temporary. The board was desperate after you were hospitalized, and Alicia reached out." "You saved my company," he said softly, wonder in his voice. "I improved the product we both cared about," she corrected him. "The same one we argued over in college, ironically enough." Ethan was quiet for a moment, studying her face. "You were in my office." It wasn't a question, but Morgan nodded anyway. "Alicia showed me the drawer, the folder with my name on it." A flush crept up his neck. "Ah." 20 years of tracking my career," she mused. "That's either incredibly sweet or alarmingly stalkerish." "I prefer to think of it as dedicated," he offered with a hint of his old humor. Morgan smiled despite herself. "You know, when I was working in your office, I found something else. The real reason you and I developed such similar senior care concepts in college." She pulled out her phone and showed him photos she'd taken of old university research papers they'd both accessed. "We read the same foundational studies, used the same research databases. We arrived at similar conclusions because we started from the same information and shared the same values." Ethan looked at the evidence, then back at her face. "We were always more alike than different," he acknowledged. "That's what made us such good friends, and what made losing that friendship so devastating." The simple honesty of his words touched something deep inside her. "I read your letters," Morgan admitted. "The ones you never sent." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. "Those were never meant to be seen." "But they needed to be," she countered gently. "I spent 20 years thinking you'd simply discarded our friendship without a second thought. You spent 20 years believing I'd moved on without looking back. We both lived with half-truths that shaped our entire lives. "And now?" Ethan asked, a vulnerability in his voice she'd rarely heard. "Where does that leave us?" Before Morgan could answer, the door opened to admit a nurse with medication and a doctor for a checkup. Morgan stepped outside to give them privacy, using the moment to collect her thoughts. Her phone buzzed with updates from the company. Lifelink's emergency launch was exceeding all expectations. The board was ecstatic. They wanted to formalize her position immediately. When she re-entered Ethan's room, she found him looking stronger, more alert after his medication. "The doctor says I can be discharged in a few days if my progress continues," he reported, "though it will be weeks before I can return to work." "The company needs leadership in the meantime," Morgan said, showing him the messages from the board. "They want me to step in officially until you're recovered." Ethan nodded slowly. "They're right. There's no one better." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "But what do you want, Morgan?" It was the question she'd been asking herself since the night of his collapse. What did she want after all these years of pushing forward, of building a career, of trying to prove herself? "I want to finish what we started," she said finally, "both professionally and personally. We were robbed of 20 years, Ethan. I'm not willing to waste any more time on misunderstandings and pride." Hope bloomed in his eyes. "Does that mean you'll take the CEO position?" "Temporarily," she agreed with a small smile, "until you're well enough to come back. After that, we'll need to figure out a new arrangement. I'm thinking co-CEOs could work." "Co-CEOs," he repeated, testing the idea. That would be unprecedented. "So is everything about this situation," Morgan pointed out. "Besides, we always did our best work as a team." Ethan reached for her hand, his touch sending a familiar warmth through her. "And personally? What does finishing what we started mean in that context?" Morgan interlaced her fingers with his. "It means we stop wasting time. We see where this connection between us leads. We build something new from the foundations of what we had." "I'd like that," he said softly. "I've missed you, Morgan. Every day for 20 years. "I've missed you too," she admitted. "Even when I was angry at you, there was always this Ethan-shaped hole in my life that nothing else could fill." He tugged gently on her hand, pulling her closer. "We have a lot of catching up to do." "Starting now," she agreed, leaning down to press her lips softly against his. 1 year later, Ethan and Morgan married in a small ceremony in the garden of his grandmother's old care facility, now transformed into a showcase for their Lifelink technology. Morgan's father, healthier thanks to treatments their success had funded, proudly walked her down the aisle. "Worth the wait," Ethan whispered as they exchanged vows. Morgan smiled, her heart full. Every minute. The former rivals now led Carter Wellness together as co-CEOs, their innovative partnership bringing the company unprecedented success. They had established a foundation providing their technology to underserved senior communities, fulfilling the vision they'd shared as college students. On a small table beside them stood a photograph from their college days and a model of the Lifelink system, tangible proof that sometimes life's second chances yield the greatest rewards. Like rivers separated by mountains that eventually find their way to the same ocean, even paths divided by misunderstanding and time can converge when guided by truth. The bridges we burn in haste often require the most courage to rebuild, but in their reconstruction, we discover that the connection is stronger for having known separation. Perhaps the most sophisticated technology isn't found in our devices or innovations, but in the human heart's remarkable capacity to sync with another after years of keeping time alone. Don't forget to like this video if you believe in the power of love to break down walls and bridge any divide. Please do comment your feedback and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of family, redemption, and the triumph of love over pride. Remember, it's never too late to change your story.